guys, so I'm here today to share with you some of my favourite standalone fantasy books. I think oftentimes it seems as though fantasy is a genre which is full of series and there is ne'er a standalone in sight, which can be particularly intimidating if you're just trying to get into the genre and you don't want to be starting tons of big chunky series, which they often end up being. Or if, like me, you're already a fantasy fan but just don't want to commit to something quite as long as the series can end up being and want a short, interesting adventure. I'm here to tell you, however, there are some amazing standalone fantasy books out there and these are some of my favourites. Hopefully this will also be helpful to those of you that are participating in the Femme Fantail Readathon, which is a readathon I run with my friend Jill and is taking place once again at the end of August. I will link the readathon announcement video down below, but because there is a few books in this video, I don't want to waste any more time jibber jabbering. I'm going to get straight in. In no particular order, the first book I'm going to mention is Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton. This book for me brings together my adoration of dragons and fantasy focused around magical creatures, as well as kind of Regency era history. This book is set in a world that very much resembles Regency England or Regency Britain, but instead of following aristocratic human families, we're following aristocratic dragon families because basically all of the human characters are replaced with dragons. It's reminiscent of an Austen or a Trollope. It balances romance, family matters and political intrigue. So we follow a family a little bit like in many Jane Austen novels where the father has recently died and his daughters are having to find their way in the world without too much money to their name. He has a son that has joined the clergy, another who works in the sort of city and in the political world, and then, like I mentioned, his daughters who are trying to find advantageous marriages. Again, so similar to something you might find in an Austen novel, yet none of it feels out of place in this dragon world. Jo Walton perfectly brings this kind of Regency sensibility to a fantasy world, and it is believable because she changes enough of society and societal expectations to fit in with her dragon characters, and she also does a lot of phenomenal world building around these dragons and kind of dragon lore to create really believable characters. And honestly, I think even if you aren't as hardcore into dragons as I am, you will enjoy this novel if you are into fantasy of manners or fantasy meets historical fiction, because it's just perfection. Next up is Chalice by Robin McKinley. Now, Robin McKinley is a fantasy author who actually has quite a few standalones, so her back catalogue is well worth checking out. But one of my favourites is, of course, Chalice, which is such a soft, slow, quaint fantasy novel. It is not full of huge amounts of drama and it feels very much about the protagonist and Robin McKinley just kind of like weaving a wonderful fantastical world with lots of lovely details. But our protagonist is a young beekeeper in a fantasy world that mimics a lot of fantasy settings which often harken back to kind of medieval history, and she has recently been given the appointment of becoming the new Chalice. So in her world, the humans have to have this ongoing relationship with the land that they live on, and that is kind of communicated through a small council, one of whom is the Chalice, and she has been picked as the new Chalice. It wasn't really her plan. She liked her beekeeping duties, but this is who she is now, which means she's sort of like the right hand to the new master of this town. Now, equally, this new man in charge, you could call him, had never intended on becoming the master of this town. He had been a younger sibling whose older brother was to take over this role but has now died, and he had been sent away to join this church that basically turns its worshippers or its clergy into like these weird mythical fire creatures. They almost lose their humanity, and he is quite far into this process, so he has to return back to his home to take this place on the council even though he's not entirely human. And it's about his and our protagonist's relationship and kind of making things work in this world, and it's just lovely and, like I said, quaint and quiet but beautiful. Something with a little bit more mystery, intrigue and drama is Alphabet of Thorns by Patricia A. McKillop, another incredible fantasy author with quite a few standalones in her back catalogue, but Alphabet of Thorns is my favourite so far, and it weaves together 4 different point of views. We have an orphan who was raised by the library to be a translator, and she works in the this library, translating different scripts because she just has a way with language. We also follow the new queen of this world, who was not expecting to become a queen quite so young, and is really overwhelmed by her new duties. We follow an ancient magician who is, you know, well into her hundreds and was like advisor to the previous king, who was this queen's father, and is now trying to help the new queen readjust. And we also follow a young mage or magician who is a young man currently studying the craft of magery and begins a relationship with our orphaned translator. And playing a new role in these characters' lives is this new tomb that has found its way into the hands of this translator at the library, and she is trying to figure out what this text says because it's in a language that nobody else recognises, and there's something magical to it, and it potentially poses a threat. So it's about all of these stories weaving together. It is so beautiful. Patricia A. McKillip's writing is stunning. I think this book has a lot of the elements of like traditional fantasy that, you know, people who already love fantasy will love and will harken back to kind of the 20th century, but equally I think it's something that people who are new to fantasy could really enjoy. If you're looking for something particularly short though, I thought I would mention a short story novella. I'm not sure which category this would quite fit under, but that is The Terracotta Bride. This is a short tale set in the underworld or afterlife based on traditional Chinese beliefs surrounding this. And our protagonist is a girl that died quite young and was then married off in the afterlife by some of her deceased relatives to a rich man in this underworld. And she has suddenly been joined by a second wife who is a terracotta bride, i.e. she was never living in the real world. She was made out of terracotta, then dedicated to this young girl's husband, and it's about her relationship with this terracotta bride and about her finding herself and her strength even after death. And it is so stunning, so beautiful. There are also queer elements to it, and I would highly recommend it. Something I would actually say is quite light on the fantasy but could certainly come under this category is Oh My God by Alexandra Shepherd. This one is perfect for those of you that are more into your contemporary YA books but perhaps are looking to read something with more fantastical elements, because our protagonist in this book is a teenage girl living in London who has recently had to move in with her dad. For a few years she's been living with her grandmother since her mother passed away and her mum and dad weren't together. Now she's moving in with her dad. She's adjusting to living with her half-siblings as well as her father, who she has a strained relationship with, and making new friends at this new school, all of your standard teenage drama. But her dad is actually the ancient Greek god Zeus. So her half-siblings are people like Aphrodite and Apollo, who are also Greek gods, and she herself is half mortal, half divine, and she has to keep this secret from everybody else in her life who is mortal, and it is such a fun combination of genres in that way. A more recent read for me is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is very much a fantasy romance book. I think this one is for fans of relationships and romances and couples overcoming trials but in a fantasy world, because it is about the relationship between this painter, this woman who is a famous painter and is often employed by the fair folk to paint their portraits because her craft is the most celebrated, and the relationship she develops with one of the fairy princes who has come to sit for a portrait with her. But when she finishes this portrait, she has painted human emotions in his eyes, and this is a massive embarrassment to him because the rest of the fairy court see the painting before he has a chance to hide it, and he's really angry at her, so he drags her into the fairy realm in order to, you know, kind of defend herself and explain why she did what she did. But of course, like I said, it is very much about their relationship, and I think if you like romance and you like fantasy, you will like this book. It's a lot of fun. There's tons of fae folklore in there, and I think if you like Holly Black's Cruel Prince series or you like the works of Emma Hamm, then this is one that you will also like. But since I just mentioned Holly Black, I guess I should also mention the book on this list that is by her, and that is The Darkest Part of the Forest. This is a young adult fantasy novel that is again set in our world, but is about the relationship between this world and the Fae world. It's a contemporary setting as opposed to a historical setting. So we follow a teenage girl living in contemporary America, but in a town that is very aware of the world of the Fae. Like, they know that the Fae exist. In fact, one of her friends is actually a changeling and therefore Fae himself, but lives with a mortal family. But basically, when our protagonist was younger, she made a deal with the Fae, and it is time to pay up her end of the bargain, basically. It combines a lot of the fun elements of contemporary YA, again, with fantasy, although I think it's a lot more fantastical than, say, like Oh My Gods. So if you like fairies and you like YA contemporary, you will definitely like this. We then have something that harkens back to Greek mythology in a very heavy way, and would perhaps come under the category of a literary fiction, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller. Now, I read a lot of Greek myth retellings and often recommend them on my channel. I have a whole list on my blog of like over 100, so you can check that out if you're interested. But I think this one particularly fits into fantasy because it follows Circe, who is a Greek goddess as well as a witch. So she often uses magic in this book. She uses magic, she comes across magic, and she also constantly comes in touch with different gods and mythical creatures. So, you know, it feels like fantasy to me. It's also one of my favourite Greek myth retellings. It follows the story of this goddess who's often seen as an outsider from other characters of Greek mythology. She pops up here and there. She lives a solitary life on an island that she's been exiled to, but strings together her life as one continuous narrative, and I think it is masterfully done, would highly recommend. But moving on from Greek myth retellings to fairy tale retellings, I do actually have 3 fairy tale retellings on this list, and the first one is Entreat Me by Grace Draven. This one is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, which unsurprisingly also very much makes it a romance novel. Grace Draven is most popular for her fantasy romances, and I love them. She does some of my favourite romance books, some of my favourite fantasy books, and this one is no exception. It also has some smuttier chapters to it, so if that's something you look for in your romance, then this is one worth checking out. But it's also one of my favourite fairy tale retellings and fantasy novels because of the really engaging relationship between all the characters. We have our protagonist, who's actually the older half-sister to a younger sister, who runs away with this young man to go to his castle, and she chases after them, refusing to let them live alone together until they are married in case her reputation is ruined, and she wants to make sure that their love is real and that he's not going to toss her aside. Essentially, she feels very protective of her younger sister, and while she's there, she discovers that this young man also lives with his father, and she develops a relationship with this character. Now, of course, there are your traditional Beauty and the Beast elements going on there. There's a dark curse over this place, and our young women have to figure out what that is and what it means to them. But like I said, love the relationships between these characters. The banter and witty exchanges between our older sister and the father are brilliant, and I would just highly recommend this book. But whilst I'm on the topic of Beauty and the Beast, I do have another Beauty and the Beast retelling to mention, and this one is Heart's Blood by Juliet Marillier. I know, how has it taken me so long to mention Marillier in this video? Well, this is actually her only fantasy book that I'm aware of at the moment, and like I mentioned, it is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. It follows our Beauty character who has run away from home because of an abusive situation, and I think throughout this book Marillier really attempts to tackle the subject of abuse in a careful and honest way, whilst building this romance between the Beast and Beauty characters. She ends up getting a job in this castle, which is owned by a man who lives his life quite separate from the outside world. He has a few companions that live with him and advise him, and you know, just provide him conversation, who have their own secrets that you don't initially know, but does not interact much with the rest of the world. This is because he is under, of course, some sort of curse, which you discover as the book goes on, and Juliet Marillier has, in her reliable way, brought her own twist to this story, and built a really creative fantasy world. But like I mentioned, our Beauty character has gotten a job as a scribe in this castle, and it's about her relationships with its inhabitants and her discovering the mysteries of the place that she finds herself living. But if you do like mystery, I would also like to recommend to you Perfectly Preventable Deaths by Deirdre Sullivan. This is a young adult paranormal fantasy mystery thriller. Combines a lot of things there, but I think it is all of them, and it is wonderful at being all of them. We follow one of 2 twin sisters who has moved with her family because her mother has remarried to a small rural town in Ireland. They are Irish themselves, but they have grown up somewhere a little bit more populated than where they've come to now. And this little village is quite a tight-knit community. Our sisters initially find it quite difficult to fit in, and there are clearly a lot of secrets lurking in the background. But whilst one sister is developing a romance with a kind of inappropriate, potentially dangerous young man, our main character is discovering that she may actually have an affinity for witchcraft, and it is about her finding her place in this new town and also trying to protect her sister from any possible threats. Again, very dark, very creepy, manages to explore feminist themes of sexism through this kind of paranormal storyline, and also deals with a coming out storyline, so lots to get your teeth stuck into there. But then I did have one more fairy tale retelling, and that is The Raven and the Reindeer by T. Kingfisher, someone else with lots of standalone fantasy books, so you can check them out on Goodreads or wherever you kind of look up your books. But this is the one I wanted to mention here, and it's also queer. It is a female romantic retelling of the Snow Queen fairy tale. So our main character's best friend and the boy she thinks she's in love with is kidnapped by the Snow Queen, or perhaps he goes willingly, it's not quite clear initially, and she decides to go after and save him despite the fact that everyone's saying there's nothing you can do when the Snow Queen takes somebody. She, however, is determined, storms off, and has her mind set on saving the boy she thinks she loves. Along the way, she also ends up meeting a young female warrior who helps her on her journey and potentially opens up new feelings within her. It's so cute and often laugh out loud funny, so would again highly recommend. But two more before I'm done. The next one is Summers at Castle Auburn by Sharon Shin. This is another fae fantasy novel set in a nameless historical period where there are kings and queens, and our protagonist is a girl slash young woman who is the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman. And although when she's a child she's not aware of this, when it does come out, her uncle, since her father is now deceased, invites her to come live in what should be her home. Her grandmother is not so keen on this, as she's the one that has raised this young girl and only allows her to go every summer, which means that our protagonist spends every summer at Castle Auburn with her half-sister and the other noble children, including a prince, and it's about her growing up at this castle every summer and learning more about herself and the people around her and the nuances of life at court, and perhaps everything isn't as perfect as it seems or as desirable as she initially thought it was to be a part of. But there's a fantasy element to this story. In this world, fairies are kept as slaves by the humans. They are captured by fairy hunters who use iron shackles, which they are allergic to keep them in slavery, and they kind of serve the royalty and the nobility. And she grows up around these enslaved fairies. Her childhood, as she spends her summers in this castle, and at first doesn't question it, but as the book goes on starts to realise how cruel this actually is, and it's very much a coming of age story and a learning about the world story. The last one I'm currently in the process of reading, so haven't finished, but at this point would still recommend, and that is the Gilda Stories by Joe Gomez. This is a book set during slavery era America in the 19th century, and is actually based around vampire lore. So our main character is a young black girl who is taken in by Gilda, a woman that runs a brothel, but there's a lot more to her than first meets the eye. She is, in fact, of course, like I mentioned, a vampire, and it is a fantasy novel and it is a paranormal novel because of course there is these fantastical paranormal elements of vampires and people living for hundreds and hundreds of years, but at the same time it also very much feels like a kind of literary historical novel that tackles racism, sexism and homophobia, because this is also a queer fantasy novel, which is something I am always on the hunt for. But those are all these standalone fantasy books I'm going to mention in this video. They're certainly not all of the ones I've read and enjoyed, but when it came to having read multiple standalones by certain authors, I decided just to pick one and mention that to you. So if you want to check out more of their works, you can. I would love to know what your favourite standalone fantasy novels are, so please do leave your recommendations down below, and I hope you did discover something new in this video. Until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!